Roisin, everybody can hear me okay, yeah?
Yep.
I'd say I'll keep this relatively brief because the remainder of our talks are all kind of following a similar-ish format based around the Landscapes of Archaeology, Landscapes of Revolution project. And the Landscapes of Revolution project was something that kind of came into being about a decade or so ago, largely in response, and I think it's worth saying it at the outset here, largely in response to the fact that we have, I think, a bit of a crisis in the archaeology and the landscapes of this period, post-medieval generally in Ireland, but very noticeable during the decade of centenaries, that we do need to have some form of analysis of these sites that relate to 1916, to the War of Independence and the Civil War. And we've seen through a lot of the talks that have, some of the brilliant talks that we've had so far today, what archaeology can tell us about these sites. But I have argued elsewhere that in Ireland, a lot of these sites aren't actually seen as landscapes of conflict. It's been completely dominated really in an Irish context, quite understandably so, that these are landscapes of memory. And so I would challenge you, if you've ever been to a site in Ireland, if you've been to Bale-na-Blaw, which we'll be hearing about later, if you've been to Kilmichael, if you've been to Crossbarry, big sites in Cork, what have you actually visited when you've gone to these sites? And in nearly every case, what you will have visited is a memorial that was placed on these sites years, sometimes decades after the event. And it has been a cause of big concern to me. Because Irish archaeology is perceived to stop around 1700, we have no real mechanism of recording these sites afterwards, that we don't know very much about them. And it would be true to say that we know, for example, more about early medieval ring forts than we do about the status and condition of RIC barracks that were attacked by the IRA in the War of Independence. So the Landscapes of Archaeology project was kind of conceived to address this issue, to try and start thinking about ways that we could look to map, record this material. Number one, so that we might want to protect this. Number two, so that we can manage these landscapes. And I think we've seen over the course of a few different instances over the decade of centenaries, where it does cause problems if it hasn't been considered when you're trying to manage landscapes or manage development. And also look then at how the community can be involved. And really community involvement is key in this, almost to a degree that isn't possible in a lot of other levels of archaeology, but really contributing. Local communities can contribute directly towards knowledge creation in a way that they often can't do, because they are the ones who have an awful lot of the detail in relation to what went on in their local areas in the War of Independence. Often not written down, the type of information we're looking for, often kind of recorded orally locally. And so in 2014, the Landscapes of Revolution project, which is currently being supported by Abarta Heritage, has had a lot of iterations. It was started when I was at Rubicon Heritage, and also worked with the Middle Tennessee State University on parts of the project as well. But back in 2014, we were approached by the local historical society in Knockraha, which is a small rural area of County Cork, to look for a underground bomb making factory that was located in the area. And it quickly became apparent, because of the degree of work that the local historians and the local community had put into recording people. Martin Corrie was the local captain of the Irish volunteers in the area. He had been recorded locally in the 1960s. And also then, because of the knowledge that had been passed down through direct family relations in the area, coupled with the incredible resources that we can get now out of places like the Irish Military Archives, looking at witness statements to try and find locationary evidence, it was apparent that there was an opportunity to plot not just where this bomb factory was, but to try and plot the impact of the War of Independence on one locality. So the company area was the building block of the IRA during the War of Independence. These company, volunteer companies that were based around what was normally a town or a parish. And so we were seeking to identify these locations. So we're going to be hearing a couple more talks after this on different projects that have more or less involvement with Landscapes of Revolution, but all of them have some presence on the Landscapes of Revolution page, which you can check out at landscapesofrevolution.com. And there's a lot of projects that we're not talking about today that are on it. But again, I also felt in a lot of areas, we do have this fascination with the ambush. that these kind of violent actions, the idea of the flying column, the active service unit engaged, is what we kind of come away with most out of the IRA and that period. But of course, it was an awful lot more than that. It's an area, plenty of IRA volunteers never even handled the gun during the War of Independence. There's a lot of people involved, like Cumann na MBan, for example, who are playing key roles. And so there's a whole area around these actual engagement sites that are relevant from an archaeological perspective. And here are just some of them: encampments, approach routes, retreat routes, buildings. As we were hearing earlier, archaeological monuments. So plenty, for example, things like souterrains are used as arms dumps in the War of Independence. So that civilian participation, I think, is something that's really important to try and capture in an archaeological sense. Something that looks across the entire landscape, because this was a war that had to use and did use the entire landscape. A lot of it is preserved and, as I say, unprotected heritage. This photograph on the right is some of these were Company of Cork's 1st Battalion. So the East Cork IRA, these are guys who were involved in significant actions, the most infamous being Clonmult, which was the heaviest loss of life inflicted on an IRA column during the War of Independence, when a number of their members were surrounded and captured in a cottage in Clonmult. But Company of the 4th Battalion of Cork No. 1 Brigade is particularly interesting because there was never an action fought in Knockraha. That company was never physically engaged in fighting the British. So as Dr. John Borgonovo has put it, it is a quiet zone. This is under the command of Captain Martin Corrie, as I say, but there is nothing happening at Knockraha. If you were to just look at it purely from an action point of view. Dr. John Borgonovo talks about a Cork No. 1 Brigade forbade attacks on the Crown forces in the Knockraha area. From the perspective of the Crown forces, the parish was one of the most inactive in County Cork. So in other words, they thought the IRA wasn't there at all. And of course, the reason there was an order not to attack there is because it was probably the most important logistical base for the IRA in East Cork and for Cork No. 1 Brigade. It is the area where they tried to centre and concentrate an awful lot of their activities, their stockpiling. They imprisoned people there, they executed people there, they produced bombs there, okay? So the bomb factories, there was a local bomb factory run by the company. There was also another bomb factory run by the brigade. So, and they didn't particularly get on. So again, you're getting an interesting insight into the IRA. Arms that were captured throughout East Cork tended to be taken to Knockraha. And this is the type of locationary evidence that we can get out of things like witness statements that we see repeatedly. It was a vital training base. When active service units and flying columns were being set up towards the latter part of 1920, Knockraha was where they chose to establish the East Cork flying column. Safe houses, which I feel are some of the least understood but yet vital elements of our IRA landscapes currently. None of these are registered anywhere because they don't match the criteria generally of our current, what we currently have in our armory in relation to protection or recording, things like the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. Safe houses, absolutely vital locations where the IRA could hide out, but also locations where Cumann na MBan could carry out, say, fundraising activities and so on. It was the main place of retreat. When you analyze the witness statements, as an archaeologist looking at them for location evidence, it becomes apparent that Knockraha is the place that there was a standing order for the IRA in East Cork to retreat to. So after the terrible defeat at Clonmult, for example, IRA men in different parts of East Cork all automatically went to Knockraha. They say so in their witness statements. It was an important prison. Knockraha is famous for its prison, as we'll see just shortly in a second, and an execution site where suspected spies were executed under the orders of the 1st Brigade of the IRA in Cork. So, as I say, the main reason that we were looking at the site was initially to try and prove that this bomb factory in Ballynanela townland existed. And this photo shows the men who produced the bombs with some of the molds standing outside the dugout that they used during the truce. And it was the brainchild of this man, Ned Fitzgerald, whose nephew was the man who initially contacted me from the Knockraha Area Historical Society, William Fitzgerald. And Ned, age 23, had been in university in Cork and come back out, and Martin Corrie had given him the use of his dugout. We have this in the recordings, the use of his dugout that he had been using for arms storage in order to start producing grenades for the IRA. And we even have a sketch of what it looked like. This was the way that the dugout was adapted. A number of cabbage machines were converted to enable them to make the grenade and to create molten metal. And so you can see quite a substantial structure here that certainly is of highly significant archaeological interest. But when you get involved with the local communities, one of the really fascinating elements is that it gives you what can often be quite ordinary objects. It gives an incredible archaeological resonance. So here we see some of the original grenade molds that were used in this Knockraha company. But on the right, we have what, for all intents and purposes, looks like an ordinary cattle trough. But that was actually used in the bomb factory, this water trough, for the molten metal. I don't have an image of it here, but there's also a ordinary broom handle with the top of a kettle on the top of it that's in William's possession still, that was used as a crucible for pouring the molten metal. So this kind of tangible elements of this one company, this one local area's IRA past, still surviving in and around the locale. We were able to confirm that the precise location of the dugout, and this is it. It looks pretty nondescript at the moment. It was filled in the years afterwards because cattle, the risk of cattle falling into it, which I think is the fate probably of an awful lot of dugouts in and around the country. But it was described as a dugout under Dinny Lynch's furze break. And so to try and identify these sites, we were looking at all the readily available witness statements, at all the available accounts. We were going to the mapping to see where the farms between the Lynch farm and the Fitzgerald boundary was, where Denny Lynch was working, and it allowed us to identify this little kink that you can see here in the ditch is where that dugout was originally located. And so archaeologists can use an awful lot of really simple tools, things like the census of Ireland in 1911, again, freely available. And one of the purposes of landscapes is to try and encourage the community and give communities the skills to do this type of analysis themselves. And Denny Lynch is actually here. There's Dennis Lynch's son, 12 years old, located in that farm. As I said, there are lots of other sites. So the Brigade bomb factory, which was run at a brigade level, so a higher level than the company, the men were paid there. They weren't paid in the company bomb factory, was built in a steep ravine to the west of Knockraha with a small stream running under the floor. So we systematically go through looking for these type of locationary indicators, as we call them. And in fact, elements of the Blossom Grove factory have been found by the locals in that stream that still survived, that have fallen down the slope from where that bomb factory was located. One of the most significant buildings in the town still survives, forged by Ned Maloney, and we were able to locate and identify that based on the pension files that are being released by the military archives. Ned Maloney talks about how he worked with the Brigade IRA in his forge about a half a mile, and he gave him the forge while he was making a chimney, and that the first night a bomb was made with Mick Leahy, commandant of the Cork No. 1 Brigade, he got a piece of it and I got a piece of it. And that is the building where that occurred. So a very significant location for the East Cork IRA, that building. It was used as a depot area. So I'm going to run through these relatively briefly, but this is the type of information that we are getting that allows you to say the significance of a locale like this. Captured arms handed over to Knockraha Company. Michael Burke walked to Knockraha 8 miles and told him of the success of his mission. So it's been used to communicate messages. Staying at Lieutenant Fitzgerald's house at Ballinbrittis, again, which is in the Knockraha area. So an important safe house. It was here that they chose to arrange that flying column when they started the training. Ordered to chuck in my job in the Middleton Engineering Works and report to Diarmid Hurley at Knockraha, right? So you're seeing this pattern that's developing when you start looking for all this locationary stuff of the incredible importance of it. And it allows us to identify what this building here, now O'Donoghue's Bar, which was Canavan's pub in Knockraha village, which was one of the most important safe houses in all of East Cork because it's consistently referred to as an area where the IRA go. The Fitzgerald farmhouse in Ballinbrittis as well, another really important safe house. So you can start to build the movement and the network of movements across the landscape. This is in the cemetery, the local cemetery, an old tomb, and this is actually known as Sing Sing. This is what Knockraha is most famous for, named after the famous New York prison. And it was here that a number of suspected spies were held prior to their execution and burial in Knockraha. Again, this is the type of activity you can carry out in this sort of locale when you're not drawing attention on yourself by attacking RIC or Crown forces. But seemingly ordinary areas all through the village started to emerge as important parts of this IRA landscape. The local church was used by the IRA to store weaponry in it. The local creche, as is today, was used for this, what Sinn Féin courts, as they're known, where local legal cases were tried after the pulling back of the Crown forces into the major towns and cities. The building on the left here, which has since been done up, is where the local volunteers were founded originally, a place called Liberty Hall, named for Liberty Hall in Dublin. The ring forts and the souterrains are consistently referenced, these earlier archaeological monuments, as sites that are being used to store arms. In fact, Martin Corry, in one of his tapes, expressed his horror after the war to see that one of these local souterrains, these underground passages in a ring fort, was marked on a contemporary map, as they had never realized it was and had been using it to store arms. So at any point, if the British had decided to check these souterrains in the area, they would have found it. But all of these safe houses all around the area are all identifiable. And so we started to map this, and I'll kind of bring it towards a conclusion, but trying to map this location, trying to get the community engaged with the sheer scale of all of this material is really what our aim is. And it allows you to start drawing putting points on maps. So we were, for example, able to locate and pinpoint where the Upner arms dump was. The Upner was captured during the truce. It was taking RIC weaponry out of Cork Harbour. The IRA captured it and then took the weapons off it for use subsequently during the Civil War. So all of these different locations start to come alive. Knockraha village itself, the main street where the company did all its drilling in the early days before the conflict started, still there, still a space in the middle of the village. The school where the courts were, the safe houses, the church where arms were stored. And I suppose this is kind of the ultimate goal. This is the wider landscape here. And you can see we've color-coded it and marked it down. So the fields where the flying column trained, the fields where the bomb factories were located, where safe houses were. The red area hashed up in the top, is where bodies were buried effectively after any suspected spies who were executed there, with the location of dugouts in the landscape and prisons. And it immediately transforms the way you look at a landscape like this when you see the ubiquity and the sheer scale of material that's around there. Is quite remarkable. And this was only a small project, really just trying to kick it off, but something I think that needs to be replicated nationwide, led by local communities in the main, so that we can start to manage these landscapes effectively. It allows us to start looking at other things. This is a recent Abarta Heritage Landscapes of Revolution map looking at the attack on Cloyne RIC barracks, which seemingly is an isolated event against one building, but when you start to look at the landscape, again, this is East Cork, you see this is a huge operation that requires mass complex organization and planning, and is taking in buildings and fields and roads across miles and miles of territory. Okay, it presents us with a lot of opportunities when we do this. Apart from what it tells us about the activities of the IRA, it really serves, I think, to start to focus down on everybody's experience of conflict, be they IRA, be they RIC, be they civilian, during this period. And tourism is also a big opportunity. The results of our survey have been used by the local community in Knockraha to establish this, the independenceway.ie, so people can go around their locale and look at a lot of these sites that were identified. So there's such great promise with this sort of material. So I will leave it at that. If you want to check out Landscapes of Revolution, and there's a lot of projects up there now, but landscapesofrevolution.com is your only man. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Damian.